My name is Tony Banout. I'm the executive director of the Chicago Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression. And it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon along with Jamie Kalven, when I considered how to introduce Jamie and best describe him, I came up with the tag, a loyal critic. And I just shared this with you to make sure it was okay. But I think it captures, to my mind, the style of your work and your approach, both the loyal part and the critic part. I've read you, and I'm going to assume most of us are familiar with Jamie and his work and some of the recent writing, which we'll talk about, the most recent op-ed in the Chicago Tribune and prior writing. But loyal, I think, to what we both see as the Chicago tradition of free inquiry and expression and its core tenets and the principles. And critical at times of how that is lived and applied and practiced, especially in particular moments of historical contestation and challenge, I would say. So first, here's how we're going to do this. I have 3 or 4 questions that I'd like to use as springboards for a conversation between us. There'll be ample time to open it up to engage the audience and your questions as well. So we certainly want to save time to open up the conversation. But let me start by saying, hopefully this loyal criticism makes sense to you. Of course, disagree if not.
No, I'll wear that jacket.
Yeah, right. And I think it might be helpful to start by inviting you to expound a little bit on how you understand a tradition, what you mean by this important concept for, I think, your approach and how even you understand your father's approach. But
Yeah, so I would make a distinction between sort of the dead hand of tradition, a kind of hegemonic creed that we're told we all subscribe to, and a living tradition, which I take to be an argument about the content of what the tradition is. Mm-hmm. And I think that argument is fundamental both for continuously testing and refining the norm, but also for acculturating and socializing people into the tradition, if that makes sense, and so I would argue that the vitality of a tradition is to be judged by the robustness of the argument.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's, I know we've both been influenced by Alistair McIntyre's thinking on this.
That's McIntyre's formulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, historically extended, socially embedded argument about the goods that constitute it, which, to my mind, obviously presupposes that there are goods that constitute it. Mm-hmm. The norms.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And obviously invites and a living tradition, to put your gloss on it, is about the argument, the conversation. So you're adding that process is also critical for viability and bringing people into the tradition and continuing it.
Right. And I would draw the distinction between a creed and a practice in that regard. A creed handed down, engraved in stone, a practice being that vital argument, and a willingness to go back to the mat again and again to test the norm against new fact situations, new historical circumstances. My dad was a First Amendment scholar, and I spent many years after he died finishing a book, a manuscript that he had left on a sort of intellectual history of the First Amendment at the level of the Supreme Court. And it was about 1,200 pages in manuscript. And it was literally a first draft in the sense that he just kept writing. He was a fluent writer. He kept writing and writing. And then each summer, or when he had a break from teaching, he would read through the manuscript and write marginalia, from an exclamation mark, or this is swell was one of my favorites. This chapter is swell. To hold, kind of pages, handwritten pages opposite a page of text. And one of the most, so this is sort of handwritten in a note to himself, but I think it goes to the heart of his understanding of what a tradition is. He was a great admirer of Justice Hugo Black, who had a sort of absolute reading of the First Amendment. It means what it says. And that often guided Black, particularly in the 50s, to be a more reliable champion for First Amendment values than a lot of his colleagues. But opposite, so in a passage about Black, I can't remember the particular Supreme Court decision he was writing about, he wrote, "It's a sad flaw amidst so much gallantry." Or Black's absolutism is a sad flaw amidst so much gallantry. And he goes on to say, for my own part, I believe the First Amendment is almost an absolute. And that means that you have to win by sweat again and again, case by case by case. And I think that notion of almost an when I read the Kalven Report, and the passage on a presumption against the university as an institution, speaking on social and political issues, I translate that presumption, the legal term presumption, as almost an absolute. And I think from my point of view, and I'm, not directly part of the university community except by birth, but have been in these conversations for a long time. My question would be whether there has been that kind of practice of really engaging the question, the challenge, the conversation, over time. And has there been, I think what was sort of projected by the drafters, and you can see this in some of the correspondence and the papers among committee members. I think, what was, and certainly it's easier for me to attach this to my father, knowing what certain words meant to him, is I think he foresaw a sort of common law practice evolving, case after case, and reasons given, and reflections about the parameters of the principle, and a kind of cumulative deepening knowledge of what the principle means. And I just wonder if that has in fact happened and unfolded.
Yeah, so, and we're certainly going to talk about that.
Yeah.
So let's take for argument's sake that we agree that a good that constitutes this tradition, we might have different understandings of the meaning of this good, but is the notion of, to quote the report, neutrality of the institution, to use those words. Now, it's obviously more complicated because I know I'm pulling out one spot. There's obligations and exceptions that we'll talk about, but let me say, I think this is the good that we're arguing over as a community. Would you name that good differently?
I would name that good differently.
How would you name that good?
I think neutrality has been a really problematic term as it's kind of hardened around more subtle sort of principle. I mean, I think the maybe reticence is a better word, silence. I mean, I think what is right now, I think we're confronted with a kind of fascinating paradox arising out of the document as it's read at different times in different contexts. At the time it was written, and my father did write it, I mean, the drafts are in his handwriting and the language is characteristically his. It was this kind of counterintuitive notion that by institutional silence, you create space, you create oxygen for people to think their own thoughts, speak their own thoughts, be robustly engaged with each other in political and intellectual discourse. And so I'm not sure what you call that, but neutrality doesn't feel like the right. It feels to me like a profound institutional commitment to creating the conditions for the most free and robust and uninhibited discourse about important matters. So it's that sort of affirmative part of it that gets lost in the word neutrality.
Sure.
To my ear.
Yeah, and then some people will say, I'm going to try to be a good moderator and not reveal too much of my own opinion here, but I do see it differently.
Yeah.
And I just observationally, like the report uses the term, but allowing that some people will say that it is a term of art or a technical term, and sure, you could explicate a notion of reticence or restraint that essentially gets at the heart of the matter, which is the assumption that careful moderation of when the institution uses its voice is necessary out of, and this is in the words of the document too, which are strong words, the obligation to cherish a diversity of viewpoints. It mentions obligation in 3 points, including the obligation to cherish a diversity of viewpoints. So that's the,
Yeah, I guess I don't want to over argue the point about neutrality. It seems to me a kind of antiseptic word for the core values that are being expressed, which have to do with creating the conditions for the most free and just untrammeled kind of intellectual and political discourse. And if that's what it's about, then in different moments, confronted with different circumstances, right?
Right.
You could approach the question differently.
right.
What do we do now in the current state of play to create the conditions for the freest, most unafraid kind of intellectual and political
So
discourse?
the other thing that comes to mind as you're saying this now and you're talking about the value is the line that says the obligation clause. What our friend Nadine Strawson calls the obligation clause, when the mission or core values of free inquiry, it names the core values, uses plural values, but states free inquiry, are challenged, the university is obligated to act. So that's the.
Well, also, just in terms of diction and the flavor of the language, that paragraph is very different from all of the kind of nuanced language around the presumption. That paragraph is stating something close to a moral imperative, it seems to me.
So let's get maybe more practical and contemporary. And I want to ask you two things, and you can take it any direction you want. So when I was rereading and prepping, I went back to the 2006 Maroon op-ed you wrote, which inspired the title of this conversation, Unfinished Business of the Kalven Report. And of course, I went back to the more recent Tribune op-ed, not quite 2 weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, titled, "Is it time for the University of Chicago to abandon cherished neutrality and join the fight?" Not your title, I've learned. Some editorial discretion was taken there.
One of the things about being a writer is you almost never get to title your own work. I was traveling, so I didn't even see copy. I would have correct. The original title was "A Defining Moment for Higher Education," which I truly think this is, and I doubt I'll get many dissents from that proposition.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I'd like to shift. So what are you trying to say now and in that Tribune piece? What makes this a defining moment for higher education?
Prior to the inauguration, I have a colleague here who I probably had this conversation with. I was just urging my shell-shocked friends and colleagues not to, just to be kind of wide awake and lucid and attentive, and not to allow our dread of what was coming to just sort of shape our perceptions and projections into the future. After 2 weeks of Trump 2.0, it seemed to me it would be delusional not to recognize that they're coming full force for higher education, as for foreign aid, as for the press. And to, I mean, a critical point for me, two points in the Kalven Report context. One is it would be beyond ironic at this point if the Kalven Report, given its commitment to sort of fearless, open discourse, sort of provided quote unquote principled cover for people not to confront what threatens higher education at the moment, not to engage, not to take it on. And we had the phenomena after the protests in the spring on campuses of sort of heavy promotion of the Kalven Report by some national organizations. I think at latest count, more than 25 institutions adopting some version of it. I trust that folks are feeling a sense of kind of whiplash now, or maybe reading the report quite differently. The distribution falls very differently now, and the paragraph of obligation seems to me what's central in the report, and it was something that people would have just passed over before and not, not seen as sort of the heart of it. So I think that's one danger. I think the other danger, though, is to fail to recognize that there is a multi-pronged attack, a multi-pronged, sustained, fierce, heedless effort that is just now building to enforce a censorship regime, basically to determine the parameters of permissible discourse. And if we just focus on focus on DEI, focus on NIH cuts, focus on threatens to deport students for exercising their First Amendment rights, I think there's a danger of a kind of cost-benefit logic taking hold. Well, we'll accommodate to this, we'll accommodate to that in order to live to fight another day, that kind of logic. And I think that would be deeply, deeply wrong-headed and a failure to recognize, the nature of what is being imposed and the importance of resisting it at every point it can be resisted.
How do you see, so a couple of things I'll observe and mirror back to you, like sometimes you use the phrase, the weight of distribution, is that your phrase?
Well, distribution of
the weight. Your
distribution of
interpretive
emphasis.
emphasis. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the term I was looking for. The distribution of emphasis, which I take to be the interpretive burden, falls heavier on the obligation and exception language now than it ordinarily would. And it sounds like you have always read it as speaking more to the heart of the issue, the heart of the value.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks more explicitly than any other portion of the document. Yeah.
So I guess this. Sorry, were you gonna?
No, go ahead.
The question I would have is, what are you seeing this university and other universities do or not do right now in response in this volatile and very dynamic and changing environment?
I think it's a very mixed bag. We saw early on, Harvard adopt a set of regulations about anti-Semitism that it seems to me very clearly violate any notion of intellectual freedom and free discourse. The president of this university, I think, spoke out appropriately and used the word obligation in response to the NIH cuts.
Right.
I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut and am the most diffident, indifferent alumnus. But I've been sort of proud of Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan, speaking repeatedly that these issues have to be taken on frontally. But I think it's very much up for grabs. And I think, the challenge is and I think this is why it's so, and I don't want to presume to, I didn't in the Tribune piece, despite the title it was given, I don't presume to have answers to all the specific questions that are going to confront university communities and university leadership. I think the thing that's critically important right now is just that we work together to achieve a degree of diagnostic clarity about what's happening and what it might entail for us as individuals, members of a community, members of an institution. I think that that is the crux, and the danger that I see, and across the spectrum of different university responses, and I should say different sectors of the society. It's been shocking the degree to which corporate America has accommodated itself. And Timothy Snyder uses the term anticipatory obedience. We're seeing that all over the place, including in the media. Just astonishing things on the part of some major legacy media. So I think there's that's a gravitational field to be resisted, and you have an administration. I am beginning to adopt the term regime rather than administration that is trying to project and assert power. Way beyond any notion of its electoral quote unquote mandate, way beyond the fragility of its coalition. But to the extent that people sort of accommodate to that narrative, accept it, they might as well have a mandate. Right. So I think that, the critical line, I don't know where it is, and it may be located at different points for different people, is most of life, our everyday lives, our collective and associational lives in businesses and enterprises, is governed by some form of cost-benefit calculation. Is a particular course of action worth pursuing in light of what it would cost? Is there a probability of benefits that would, outweigh the costs? We're sort of conditioned to think that way. And I think what the obligations passage in the Kalven Report, touches on is there's some situations in which the costs are incalculable. There's some situations when the costs go to you're very you can't make a concession and remain you. And I think that extends to institutions, right? And we all know the Faust legend. That's the power of it. The idea of sort of selling your soul. And so where are those lines? Where are those lines? And how do you maintain, through your own conduct, voice, and choices, your own clarity, and not just, make the small concession and the small concession and, the logic of, well, this is the best thing for the institution and we'll live to fight another day. You may well find you have no fight in you when that day comes.
You become something else entirely.
You've lost the
There's something
capacity.
that incalculable, but I'm also hearing like incommensurable. Like it's not, you can't weigh it on the same scale. So thank you for that. And that was a lot. So we can obviously talk about any aspect of this, but I'll note the conversation is going to media, public health, universities broadly, and this university. And I want to just ask one more question about this university before we open it up for questions and larger discussion. So, as you know, since the inauguration, to my mind, reviewing things, there's been two articulations that President Alevi Santos has made. One was the address he gave at the commemoration of the 10-year anniversary of the Chicago Principles, in which he talked about a dual threat to higher education, the second being government incursion and trampling on academic freedom, and the need to stand up to that threat. And then more specifically, I think, was the example you were citing, February 11th, I believe, a message that was sent over email that communicated to the campus community that the university is party to 12 institution or something lawsuit that challenges the NIH cuts, but also they're using the language of a duty to respond, to defend what the institution is at its heart. How does all of that strike you in keeping with what you would want to see and meeting the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't see the text or wasn't present for the first occasion. I thought the NIH statement was altogether appropriate. You know, and I, as I say, I think these are going to be really difficult moments for members of the community and for the institution. And I guess the one thing that I would say, I found myself thinking about this, you know, as this occasion approached. So the initial logic of the Kalven Report, call it silence, call it reticence, call it restraint, was that by not speaking, the institution could create space, the sort of optimal space and conditions for members of the institution to speak without any inhibition. I think, you know, I mean, I'm a writer and a public voice of a certain sort, but I think there's another way and other circumstances, such as what we confront right now, where it becomes important to speak under in circumstances that are frightening and threatening for people in order to create space for other people to speak. You know, and that is the heart and the soul and the history of movements of civil resistance, you know, where people speak, and often, you know, it's a sort of almost quixotic or self-sacrificial vanguard or something of people who are prepared to speak despite the inevitability of retaliation and repression, but in so doing create space for others. So I think there's a question beyond resisting particular policies, although that is often the vehicle for this. I think there's just a question of community solidarity right now. Of I think part of what leadership means for university and for voices within the university, for the forum right now, is to speak out forcefully in order to embolden others and create space for others to speak. So I think the last thing that's called for now is institutional restraint and reticence.
With that, I'm happy to open it up for broader conversation.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, just feel free to say your name. And
Yeah, I'm Nur Sorush. I'm a faculty at MES and ISAC. Just going back to the response about NIH. Of course, I'm happy that we're not Harvard, but I'm not at all happy about that statement, because what was deeply troubling for me was that all of the kind of the threat that was tried to be projected was about the human health. I could not see a voice in that message about freedom of expression, the intellectual aspect of that, and the threat on all of the other programs and mission of the university that is funded through NIH. And I'm really scared that in trying to measure the cost and balance and in trying to keep silent, the institution will basically undermine the essential kind of promise of this country, which is the First Amendment.
Yeah.
That even if we die of hunger, it's important that we can speak up. but the message projects to the public that, hey, this is important because you might die out of cancer. So it kind of, this undermines the whole value of this university. And I was very troubled by that.
I find that a very fair criticism. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay. My name is John Wilson. I'm an alum and disloyal critic of the university. And I think there's I want to look at the history of the Kalven Report for a minute. And I think there's a danger all of us have of reading into the Kalven Report what we wish it had said rather than what it actually was saying, because it says a lot of different things in sometimes contradictory ways. And so I understand this kind of idea of trying to approach this idea that it has this potential to be an activist instrument for speaking out in times of great danger. But at the same time, I think the fundamental impulse of the Kalven Report is something very conservative. When in the summer of 1967, when the Kalven Committee is meeting, Harry Kalven is head of the disciplinary committee that suspends 58 students for engaging in a sit-in. And in my view, I think the real fundamental goal of the Kalven Report is to try and suppress protest, suppress activism by taking the university's voice out of the equation, by preventing the university from speaking out. The idea was, well, we won't have any of these destructive protests. We won't have this kind of destructive activism. And so I'm wondering whether you see that. I know Harry Kalven is a great First Amendment scholar, a defender of the right to protest, but at the same time, he's also someone who deeply cares about the University of Chicago and sees it torn apart by these protests. And do you see him as someone trying to restrict and restrain these kind of protests from happening?
You know, I don't, but I think there are all sorts of unresolved chords and tensions built into the Kalven Report. There were tensions, you know, among committee members, and part of the strategy, explicit, you can see in my dad's correspondence, was to resolve some of those tensions by moving to a level of generality and abstraction in the phrasing of the core principles. And when I was talking before about what I see as a relative failure of the practice over time, it's, you know, I mean, the way the law works when it works as we all like to believe it should, is those issues get surfaced and resurfaced, and different fact situations, challenge what people thought they understood, about the principle. So I think, one of the sort of underlying tensions, maybe the broadest, is between notions of freedom of speech in a sort of broad public forum and notions of academic freedom in a particular kind of institution. Under the First Amendment, all sorts of speech that is not understood to have much social utility, to contribute much to democratic practice, is protected because we don't trust the government to censor it. That doesn't seem to me to be the question on a university campus. The university campus, the question is more, again, what are the conditions that allow for the freest, most searching, most unafraid kind of discourse among colleagues and students and everybody in the community. Another tension, which I think has not been much talked about, is it seems to me that, apart from a failure of the Kalven Report to include staff as part of the community, there's also, I think, a way of and this would be quite at odds with my dad's general orientation to First Amendment issues, to talk about social and political questions as if speech were the only way in which we exercise freedom. We also exercise freedom through association, through acting together. right? And I think that also is sort of latent in the report. And I can imagine a discourse over the years in which those kinds of questions were surfaced and really wrestled with in response to particular circumstances. I haven't seen that, but I mean, to John's point, I think there are all sorts of the report, as is often the case with legal or quasi-legal documents, is a vessel holding competing values that are in tension with each other, and it really is sort of successive generations in interpreting the report that surface those tensions and sort of refine the articulation of the original document. And for me, one of the most resonant phrases, because it's very much language my father would characteristically use, was the report is described as a point of departure. That's the language in the report. The report presupposes ongoing conversation and elaboration.
Right. Can I add just a little bit to that?
Yeah.
Jump in, unless somebody has an immediate question. Go ahead.
Hi, Jamie. Susan Lyons, and I'm a graduate of the university's MAPS program. And as an investigative journalist, if you were to come and investigate the University of Chicago around this issue, what would you be looking for, and how would you describe the ethics of that process?
That's a good question.
That's a great question. I think of myself, having lived at the margins of the university for all these years, as sort of an ethnographer of the university. Like, what an interesting, odd culture it is, right? I think it would be just really fascinating to go back and look at just all the different instances historically when the Kalven Report has been invoked in response to challenges of one sort or another from the student body, mostly, sometimes faculty, and just sort of to look for patterns in how the institution responded, to sort of, I've said that my principal criticism, which is not, I think, inconsistent with what John was saying, is that there hasn't been this iterative evolution over time, deepening of our understanding of the words in the report. As an investigative journalist, it'd be interesting to go back and see if it was possible to recreate, in terms of that body of experience, sort of a sketch of how the university's responded. And Professor Merchant is here. We've discussed this, over coffee. It does feel to me, and again, I haven't done the investigation, so I don't want to presume, but it does seem to me that something that was intended to be a deliberative process has become a matter of administrative fiat. And that's where I would go first.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Kay. I'm a alumni. That's a really interesting question that person just asked, and I'm wondering if you have any opinion about the university completely cutting its public art funding. Meanwhile, it's spearheading a quantum mechanics facility that the community in South Shore directly opposes.
Again, I don't have enough information. I have been urging people, faculty and others, as the cuts fall in different departments, there should be, and this would be an investigative reporting type project, and maybe students and alumni would undertake it. There should be some hub, some sort of catchment area where we're capturing information about different cuts that are being made and the kind of pattern that emerges, and I don't know this, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of the earliest cuts are being made in sort of community-facing programs like the arts programming. But the danger here with a university that, and again, I speak as the ethnographer, that seems so siloed, where, you know, people can spend their whole careers without visibility of the overall institution, that, you know, who knows what that overall pattern looks like if that information is not being, I mean, I think
I feel like people can tell what the pattern is once they start paying attention.
right, but cuts are being made, you know, across the university, but they're not being reported in one place, which would be, you know, for the Maroon or for faculty and student groups concerned about these things, should be a priority, it seems to me, to just capture that information. Patterns will surely emerge.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a fourth-year student at the university studying in the Law Letters program. I wanted to ask, how do you reconcile the ideal of institutional neutrality, which is like a very intellectual and disconnected idea, with the university as a like political and physical agent that has a medical center, you know, police force? Like, how do we conceive of institutional neutrality, which seems to be often applied like merely to the university as an intellectual force with its other kind of societal roles and implications?
Yeah, I don't reconcile. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's hard to reconcile. And that was another issue within the committee, the Kalven committee. There was back and forth about that, you know, and remember, when the report was, when the committee was constituted and the report was written, urban renewal on the South Side was a very recent history. You know, it was a very recent history. So the university as a corporate entity shaping its urban environment was, you know, much more immediate than it is now. You know, my own view is that represents, what's the term in the report? You know, the kind of paramount interest.
Social values.
Yeah,
Paramount social
that warrants an exception, and that the university should be accountable in that form, and that should be you know, an open space for argument, discourse.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me that you also have attended to this in your writing. There's an argument between White and
Yeah.
Stigler, who have different ways of thinking about what becomes paramount social values versus, and this is all, I think, related to the university and its corporate activity. I think acknowledging that its corporate activity is not going to be neutral. It's going to be an actor in one way or another, right? Would you?
And shouldn't it be subject to scrutiny
Yeah.
and challenge and argument and criticism? I mean, I think that's so. You know, I think the other thing that has sort of dropped out of the history, and when I wrote that piece back in 2006 or whenever it was actually students who had come to me asking to see my dad's papers, students who were advocating for the university to divest from companies doing business with Sudan in the context of genocide in Darfur. And, you know, I was very taken with the students, and you know, I urged on them that rather than arguing against the Kalven Report, they should be arguing from it. They should adopt it as, you know, a premise and making an argument for divestment, which they did effectively. And we reached out to the one surviving member of the Kalven Committee at that point, John Hope Franklin, who was then at Duke, you know, the great Black historian of Black America, and he said this was the sort of exception we had in mind when we wrote the report. More than a footnote. Yeah.
I think there was another question.
Well, I'll just pick up on that because, I mean, and on the idea of, you know, the report hardening into a creed, and that the idea that the central thing advocated for might seem to be, making space for open discussion, because it seems like we can kind of date when a real hardening of the document happened. I mean, it was sometime before Darfur, and sometime after South African apartheid. Or, although, however conservative it may have been at the beginning, like it does seem like between somewhere in that period, the policy of the university went from treating it as a strong presumption to an absolute prohibition. We're not even going to talk about it, because at the period when they were talking about when South African apartheid came up, the university was at that point still willing to say, consider the question whether its endowment should be subject to moral, political constraints in a very exceptional case. And so the university, although it didn't divest, did subject the endowment to the Sullivan principles. But between then and Darfur, the policy of the university became, whenever anybody asked for anything like divestment, no, I'm sorry, that's something we never discuss. And so we can't talk. And when it hardens into an absolute prohibition, there's suddenly no room for this community to talk about our relation to anything, and how what we do here, is tied up with things on the other side of the world. And anyway, I just feel like that moment is a very instructive one.
Yeah, and I would just go back to a point I made early on, and I appreciate what Anton just said, is that there's also, in that refusal to engage, and using it as a barrier to discourse rather than an open invitation to have the argument, have the conversation, it's so alienating for students and for a significant number of students and a significant number of faculty. Mm-hmm. So, a principle, whatever its limitations, whatever its sort of unresolved tensions, is, I think, again, speaking, of my father's involvement, intended to support freedom of speech, freedom of discourse, comes to be seen as a tool of censorship, essentially. Which seems like a very unhappy outcome, but also a missed opportunity to, if it's a tradition, if it's a living tradition, a missed opportunity to socialize people into the tradition.
So I will offer a dissenting view, maybe in closing, and just respectfully, like it seems like there are fora for discussion, and this is one of them. And another one was when Professor Ford and others talked about divestment particularly, and that's happening. Maybe that wasn't always happening. Granted, there are moments historically that are more constrictive and more expansive, sure. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there are no fora for discussion. Reading back the obligation language, I think I said this earlier, it comes up 3 times in the report, which I kind of relearned looking at it, including the obligation to create a forum to discuss the most pressing social questions. So I think there is space to do that in the university. I think often these conversations become then who gets to make the deliberative decision.
See, but I think that
it becomes a governance question,
right? But I think that's a key distinction, which I owe to Anton Ford, which is the distinction between discussion and deliberation, which seems to me really fundamental. I mean, people can talk themselves blue in the face. Who cares? And but are there forms of deliberation that are that people kind of understand and that have been sort of laid out and that can be activated, on appropriate occasions. And I think in the absence of that, and I should just say again, this is the ethnographic perspective on the university. I've been in various conversations about the Kalven Report over the years. I've attended, faculty for about the Kalven Report. Excuse me, almost any conversation I've had with faculty about the Kalven Report almost immediately defaults to a conversation about governance in the university and faculty disenfranchisement, as many feel it. And so I think I just want to throw out another theme, and it's a forgotten part of the. I know you guys have produced the book on the Chicago canon. There's an interesting piece that fell out of it. There's a major figure in higher education and in First Amendment jurisdiction, Alexander Meiklejohn, who in, I think, the late 40s gave the Walgreen lectures at the University of Chicago. And he gave them at a time in that post-war period when official anti-communism and McCarthyism was dramatically ramping up. And the title of the slender book that emerged from those essays is Free Speech and Its Relation to Self-Government. I think if that were part of the canon,
Yeah.
it might read quite differently.
I'll tell you exactly why, well, in my view, it's a great speech, and it's about self-government, and not particularly about the university or its tradition. So I would invite you to put together a canon on free inquiry and self-government and include Meiklejohn.
I've done it already.
But I wasn't.
Yeah, but it's part. I mean, he spoke at the university,
Yes.
on this theme, and it doesn't seem to me a huge step
Yeah.
to think about what self-governance might mean within a university.
So-
It also seems
Yeah.
to me that there's a question about, in reading the Kalven Report, about how different the institution is now from when it was, written,
Yeah.
and what the implications for interpretation are from those differences.
Yeah, we do need to. I mean, I will say this is just. I have to say this, and we'll close, and we can continue the conversation. I don't think it's a huge step to then ask, what does self-government mean for the university? But I don't think that's what Meiklejohn was addressing, and that's exactly the rub of the conversation and difference within the community. How we talk about free speech in civil society and self-government and democracy is distinct from academic freedom in the setting within the university. And what I found is people have naturally different points of view on what a theory of governance for the university ought to be.
Right. And I'm only
That's-
saying that.
And those are legitimate differences of view, right?
Right. But I think I take the distinction, but I think there is a sort of provocation, something worth thinking about in the Meiklejohn formulation, that the rationale for freedom of speech heavily promoted by the Kalven Report, the Chicago Principles, et cetera, is our capacity, let's use a different word, for self-organization. For participating in, and not necessarily through democratic vote, it can take different forms, but for participating in decisions that have consequences for the community we're part of and the institution we're part of. And so I think those sort of associational questions are, largely unaddressed by the Kalven Report, whether it's students creating an encampment or faculty organizing around a specific agenda, or a department coming to some consensus about about a position. I think again, all sorts of interesting, rich questions that arise out of the report, but have not been addressed by successor generations.
I always end conversations with you with more food for thought, and I appreciate that opportunity. And in fact, my colleague Tawa is reminding me, I think that hopefully this was food for thought. There's also literal food for you. There's boxed lunches on the way out. Sorry we invited you to a lunch and you didn't eat during the conversation, but please do feel free to grab something to eat. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mike.